French cuisine consists of the cooking traditions and practices from France. In the 14th century, Guillaume Tirel, a court chef known as Taillevent, wrote Le Viandier, one of the earliest recipe collections of medieval France. During that time, French cuisine was heavily influenced by Italian cuisine. In the 17th century, chefs François, Pierre, Varenne and Marie-Antoine Carême spearheaded movements that shifted French cooking away from its foreign influences and developed France's own indigenous style. Cheese and wine are a major part of the cuisine, playing different roles regionally and nationally, with many variations and appellations originally contrôlées et laws. French cuisine was codified in the 20th century by Auguste Escoffier to become the modern haute cuisine. Escoffier, however, left out much of the local culinary character to be found in the regions of France and was considered difficult to execute by home cooks. Gastrotourism and the guide Michelin helped to acquaint people with the rich bourgeois and peasant cuisine of the French countryside starting in the 20th century. Gascon cuisine has also had great influence over the cuisine in the southwest of France. Many dishes that were once regional have proliferated in variations across the country. Knowledge of French cooking has contributed significantly to Western cuisines, and its criteria are used widely in Western cookery school boards and culinary education. In November 2010, French gastronomy was added by the UNESCO to its lists of the world's intangible cultural heritage. History. Middle Ages. In French medieval cuisine, banquets were common among the aristocracy. Multiple courses would be prepared, but served in a style called service and confusion, or all at once. Food was generally eaten by hand, meats being sliced off in large pieces held between the thumb and two fingers. The sauces were highly seasoned and thick, and heavily flavored mustards were used. Pies were a common banquet item, with the crust serving primarily as a container rather than as food itself, and it was not until the very end of the late Middle Ages that the short crust pie was developed. Meals often ended with an issue at table, which later changed into the modern dessert, and typically consisted of dragees, aged cheese and spiced wine, such as Hippocras. The ingredients of the time varied greatly according to the seasons and the church calendar, and many items were preserved with salt, spices, honey, and other preservatives. Late spring, summer, and autumn afforded abundance, while winter meals were more sparse. Livestock were slaughtered at the beginning of winter. Beef was often salted, while pork was salted and smoked. Bacon and sausages would be smoked in the chimney, while the tongue and hams were brined and dried. Cucumbers were brined as well, while greens would be packed in jars with salt. Fruits, nuts and root vegetables would be boiled in honey for preservation. Whale, dolphin and porpoise were considered fish, so during Lent, the salted meats of these sea mammals were eaten. Artificial freshwater ponds held carp, pike, tench, bream, eel, and other fish. Poultry was kept in special yards, with pigeon and squab being reserved for the elite. Game was highly prized but very rare, and included venison, wild boar, hare, rabbit, and birds. Kitchen gardens provided herbs, including some, such as tansy, rue, pennyroyal, and hyssop, which are rarely used today. Spices were treasured and very expensive at that time. They included pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and mace. Some spices used then, but no longer today, in French cuisine, are cubebs, long pepper, grains of paradise, and galangale. Sweet-sour flavors were commonly added to dishes with vinegars and verjuice combined with sugar or honey. A common form of food preparation was to finely cook, pound and strain mixtures into fine pastes and mushes, something believed to be beneficial to make use of nutrients. Visual display was prized. Brilliant colors were obtained by the addition of, for example, juices from spinach and the green part of leeks. Yellow came from saffron or egg yolk, while red came from sunflower, and purple came from Chrosophora tinctoria or Heliotropium europaeum. Gold and silver leaf were placed on food surfaces and brushed with egg whites. Elaborate and showy dishes were the result, such as tourte Marie-Antoine, which was a pastry dish made to look like a castle with chicken drumstick turrets coated with gold leaf. One of the grandest showpieces of the time was roast swan, a peacock sewn back into its skin with feathers intact, the feet and beak being gilded. Since both birds are stringy and taste unpleasant, the skin and feathers could be kept and filled with the cooked, minced and seasoned flesh of tastier birds, like goose or chicken. The most well-known French chef of the Middle Ages was Guillaume Tirel, also known as Taillevent. Taillevent worked in numerous royal kitchens during the 14th century. His first position was as a kitchen boy in 1326. He was chef to Philip VI, then the Dauphin, who was son of John II. The Dauphin became King Charles V of France in 1364, with Taillevent as his chief cook. His career spanned 66 years, and upon his death he was buried in grand style between his two wives. His tombstone represents him in armor, holding a shield with 3 cooking pots, marmites, on it. Ancient regime. Under the Ancient regime, Paris was the central hub of culture and economic activity, and as such, the most highly skilled culinary craftsmen were to be found there. Markets in Paris such as Les Halles, La Mégisserie, those found along Rue Fatard, and similar smaller versions in other cities were very important to the distribution of food. Those that gave French produce its characteristic identity were regulated by the guild system, which developed in the Middle Ages. In Paris, the guilds were regulated by city government as well as by the French crown. A guild restricted those in a given branch of the culinary industry to operate only within that field. There were 2 basic groups of guilds. First, those that supplied the raw materials, butchers, fishmongers, grain merchants, and gardeners. The second group were those that supplied prepared foods, bakers, pastry cooks, sauce makers, poulterers, and caterers. There were also guilds that offered both raw materials and prepared food, such as the charcutiers and rôtisseurs. They would supply cooked meat pies and dishes as well as raw meat and poultry. This caused issues with butchers and poulterers who sold the same raw materials. The guilds served as a training ground for those within the industry. The degrees of assistant cook, full-fledged cook and master chef were conferred. Those who reached the level of master chef were of considerable rank in their individual industry, and enjoyed a high level of income as well as economic and job security. At times, those in the royal kitchens did fall under the guild hierarchy, but it was necessary to find them a parallel appointment based on the skills after leaving the service of the royal kitchens. This was not uncommon as the Paris Cooks Guild regulations allowed for this movement. During the 16th and 17th centuries, French cuisine assimilated many new food items from the New World. Although they were slow to be adopted, records of banquets show Catherine de' Medici serving 66 turkeys at one dinner. The dish called cassoulet has its roots in the New World discovery of haricot beans, which are central to the dish's creation, but had not existed outside of the New World until its exploration by Christopher Columbus. Haute cuisine has foundations during the 17th century with a chef named Varenne. As author of works such as La Cuisine François, he is credited with publishing the first true French cookbook. His book includes the earliest known reference to roux using pork fat. The book contained two sections, one for meat days and one for fasting. His recipes marked a change from the style of cookery known in the Middle Ages to new techniques aimed at creating somewhat lighter dishes, and more modest presentations of pies as individual pastries and turnovers. Varenne also published a book on pastry in 1667 entitled Le Parfait Confiterie, which similarly updated and codified the emerging haute cuisine standards for desserts and pastries. Chef François Massielot wrote La cuisine orale et bourgeoise in 1691, during the reign of Louis XIV. The book contains menus served to the royal courts in 1690. Massielot worked mostly as a freelance cook, and was not employed by any particular household. Massielot and many other royal cooks received special privileges by association with the French royalty. They were not subject to the regulation of the guilds, therefore, they could cater weddings and banquets without restriction. His book is the first to list recipes alphabetically, perhaps a forerunner of the first culinary dictionary. It is in this book that a marinade is first seen in print, with one type for poultry and feather game, while a second is for fish and shellfish. No quantities are listed in the recipes, which suggests that Massielot was writing for trained cooks. The successive updates of La cuisine orale et bourgeoise include important refinements such as adding a glass of wine to fish stock. Definitions were also added to the 1703 edition. The 1712 edition, retitled La Nouvelle Cuisine Royale et Bourgeoise, was increased to 2 volumes, and was written in a more elaborate style with extensive explanations of technique. Additional smaller preparations are included in this edition as well, leading to lighter preparations, and adding a third course to the meal. Ragout, a stew still central to French cookery, makes its first appearance as a single dish in this edition as well. Prior to that, it was listed as a garnish. Late 18th century, early 19th century, the French Revolution was integral to the expansion of French cuisine, because it effectively abolished guilds. This meant any one chef could now produce and sell any culinary item he wished. Marie-Antoine Carême was born in 1784, 5 years before the onset of the Revolution. He spent his younger years working at a patisserie until being discovered by Charles Maurice de Talleyrand Périgord, who would later cook for the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. Prior to his employment with Talleyrand, Carême had become known for his pieces montées, which were extravagant constructions of pastry and sugar architecture. More important to Carême's career was his contribution to the refinement of French cuisine. The basis for his style of cooking came from his sauces, which he named mother sauces, often referred to as fond, meaning foundations. These base sauces, Espagnole, Velouté, and Bechamel, are still known today. Each of these sauces would be made in large quantities in his kitchen, as they were then capable of forming the basis of multiple derivatives. Carême had over 100 sauces in his repertoire. In his writings, soufflés appear for the first time. Although many of his preparations today seem extravagant, he simplified and codified an even more complex cuisine that had existed beforehand. Central to his codification of the cuisine were le maître d'hôtel français, la cuisine parisienne and l'art de la cuisine française au XIXe siècle. Late 19th century, early 20th century, Georges-Auguste Escoffier is commonly acknowledged as the central figure to the modernization of haute cuisine and organizing what would become the national cuisine of France. His influence began with the rise of some of the great hotels in Europe and America during the 1880s-1890s. The Savoy Hotel, managed by C.E. Ritz, was an early hotel in which Escoffier worked, but much of his influence came during his management of the kitchens in the Carlton from 1898 until 1921. He created a system of parties called the brigade system, which separated the professional kitchen into 5 separate stations. These 5 stations included the garde-manger, the prepared cold dishes, the entremetier, prepared starches and vegetables, the rôtisseur, prepared roasts, grilled and fried dishes, the saucier, prepared sauces and soups, and the pâtissier, prepared all pastry and desserts items. This system meant that instead of one person preparing a dish on one's own, now multiple cooks would prepare the different components for the dish. An example used is OEUFSO plat Meyerbeer. The prior system would take up to 15 minutes to prepare the dish, while in the new system, the eggs would be prepared by the entremetier, kidney grilled by the rôtisseur, truffle sauce made by the saucier, and thus the dish could be prepared in a shorter time and served quickly in the popular restaurants. Escoffier also simplified and organized the modern menu and structure of the meal. He published a series of articles in professional journals which outlined the sequence, and then he finally published his Livre des Menus in 1912. This type of service embraced the service Larousse, which Félix Urbain Dubois had made popular in the 1860s. Escoffier's largest contribution was the publication of Le Guide culinaire in 1903, which established the fundamentals of French cookery. The book was a collaboration with Philaire Gilbert E. Fetter et Suzanne B. Rebaul, Ch. Dietrich A. Calais and others. The significance of this is to illustrate the universal acceptance by multiple high-profile chefs to this new style of cooking. Le Guide culinaire de-emphasized the use of heavy sauces and leaned toward lighter fumés, which are the essence of flavor taken from fish, meat and vegetables. This style of cooking looked to create garnishes and sauces whose function is to add to the flavor of the dish, rather than mask flavors like the heavy sauces and ornate garnishes of the past. Escoffier took inspiration for his work from personal recipes in addition to recipes from Clémy, Dubois and ideas from Taillevent's Viandier, which had a modern version published in 1897. A second source for recipes came from existing peasant dishes that were translated into the refined techniques of haute cuisine. Expensive ingredients would replace the common ingredients, making the dishes much less humble. The third source of recipes was Escoffier himself, who invented many new dishes, such as pêche melba and crêpes Suzette. Escoffier updated Le Guide culinaire 4 times during his lifetime, noting in the foreword to the book's first edition that even with its 5,000 recipes, the book should not be considered an exhaustive text, and that even if it were at the point when he wrote the book, it would no longer be so tomorrow, because progress marches on each day. Mid-20th century, late 20th century, the 1960s brought about innovative thought to the French cuisine, especially because of the contribution of Portuguese immigrants who had come to the country fleeing the forced drafting to the colonial wars. Portugal was fighting in Africa. Many new dishes were introduced, as well as techniques. This period is also marked by the appearance of the Nouvelle Cuisine. The term Nouvelle Cuisine has been used many times in the history of French cuisine, which emphasized the freshness, lightness and clarity of flavor and inspired by new movements in world cuisine. In the 1740s, Mignon first used the term, but the cooking of Vincent Lachapelle and François Marin was also considered modern. In the 1960s, Henry Gault and Christian Millau revived it to describe the cooking of Paul Bocuse, Jean and Pierre Trois Gros, Michel Guérard, Roger Vergé and Raymond Oliver. These chefs were working toward rebelling against the orthodoxy of Escoffier's cuisine. Some of the chefs were students of Fernand Point at the Pyramid in Vienne, and had left to open their own restaurants. Galton Millau discovered the formula contained in 10 characteristics of this new style of cooking. The first characteristic was a rejection of excessive complication in cooking. Second, the cooking times for most fish, seafood, game birds, veal, green vegetables and pâté was greatly reduced in an attempt to preserve the natural flavors. Steaming was an important trend from this characteristic. The third characteristic was that the cuisine was made with the freshest possible ingredients. Fourth, large menus were abandoned in favor of shorter menus. Fifth, strong marinades for meat and game ceased to be used. Sixth, they stopped using heavy sauces such as espagnole and bechamel thickened with flour-based roux, in favor of seasoning the dishes with fresh herbs, quality butter, lemon juice, and vinegar. Seventh, they used regional dishes for inspiration instead of haute cuisine dishes. Eighth, new techniques were embraced and modern equipment was often used. Bocuse even used microwave ovens. Ninth, the chefs paid close attention to the dietary needs of the guests through the dishes. Tenth and finally, the chefs were extremely inventive and created new combinations and pairings. Some have speculated that to contribute to Nouvelle Cuisine was World War II, when animal protein was in short supply during the German occupation. By the mid-1980s, food writers stated that the style of cuisine had reached exhaustion and many chefs began returning to the haute cuisine style of cooking, although much of the lighter presentations and new techniques remained. National cuisine. There are many dishes that are considered part of French national cuisine today. A meal often consists of 3 courses: hors d'oeuvre or entrée, plat principal, fromage or dessert, sometimes with a salad offered before the cheese or dessert. Hors d'oeuvre, plat principal, pâtisserie, dessert,